The question basically begs no explanation. Why hasn't the U.S. military intervention in the Middle East advanced the interest of that region? Well, we could harken back to the days of the Cold War, the first Cold War, as one would have it, bearing on the timely or ad hoc intervention in Iran in 1953 in areas, when needed, so to speak. The architecture of the U.S. Relation in the region was always predicated on a takeover of the Sykes-Picot architecture in the wake of World War II, with the Quincy Accord being the clé de voûte of this whole architecture and this special relationship with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. This was never more true when, in 1971, the U.S. government decided to decouple the dollar from the gold standard and attach it to the petrodollar. This allowed them to then print ad infinitum their currency and, in thus so doing, finance their conflict whenever needed and their military intervention in that region. Obviously, things started changing when the so-called quote unquote unipolar moment uh, dawned upon us in the early 1990s. It became quickly evident, obvious, that the United States was not going to behave as a premier inter pares, but more as an hegemon with no limit to its projection of power. And this was the moment that some people, some fellow travelers, some would call them these days the neoconservatives, uh, attempted to take advantage of the situation and seize the control of the federal government. And in so doing, they promoted this idea that uh, the United States had this indispensable nation status to it, attached to it. Some would say messianic as such, but the idea behind the puff talk was to essentially create a remodeling of the Middle East. There was a first expression of this school of thought. This was part of a policy paper formulated in 1982 by an Israeli political scientist by the name of Oded Yinon. And the idea was to basically secure the realm, as the expression became known later on in another policy paper of 1996. And in so doing, the idea was to secure the realm for the U.S. proxy state in the region, i.e., the Israeli state. And in so doing, to make it short, dismantle essentially all the strong secular Arab states and fracture them alongside sectarian, religious, and ethnic fault lines. All that they needed was a seminal event, as they called it, for they understood that the American public, after the first decade following the Cold War, would not be bent on joining this military adventurism. So what we saw was the instrumentalization of the World Trade Center attacks, which I'm not going to get into detail as to who might have known what, when, but we understand now, looking back and reading back the declarations and reports from federal agencies at the time, that there were strong reason to believe that this could have been averted. And obviously, uh, the attacks were allowed to proceed. So, this being said, this was then used as a platform to completely go ahead on some kind of crusading idea, which was to bring, I quote, democracy into the region. This had never been, obviously, the policy followed by the school of the realists. Some call them the paleo conservatives. But the paleo conservatives in the United States lost that intellectual debate to a more active, militant, and organized faction, which originally came from the Democratic Party, but they pretty much are their own brand. They attach themselves either to the Democrats under Scoop Jackson or to George Bush, to the Republican Party, invoking the Reagan doctrine whenever that suits them. But the idea is always the same. It's basically to clear the deck and replace the personnel in some of those countries, which might have been assets of the intelligence agencies, with what you might call a more manageable chaos. So the idea was never, in as far as promoting anything in terms of development and or democratic value, something bearing on promoting the betterment of the peoples of the region as a whole, but instead to create this kind of constant, one might say, status quo, which would justify U.S. military presence, and in so doing, keep an eye on, of course, natural resources in this most sensitive region of the world, but also to prevent any kind of regional power to emerge and rival that of, at the time, and still today to some extent, is considered the most powerful military in the region, the Israeli military. So we saw a series of those actions being undertaken in earnest, and it actually leaked. One recalls the intervention of Wesley Clark, the former NATO commander, who demurring about walking the halls of the Pentagon, bumped into one of his colleagues, and it was immediately somewhat put on the table that they were not going to just go into Afghanistan to get so-called the author behind the 9/11 attacks. It was a lot more pernicious. The agenda would involve, as he said, taking out 7 countries in 5 years, including Iraq, Libya, Sudan, Lebanon, Syria, and to finish with Iran. This obviously agenda found its limits in the Syrian context. When Vladimir Putin made his speech in February 2007 in Munich, we knew that the wind was turning, and it was only a matter of time before the Russian Federation felt, I would guess, logistically ready to intervene at the invitation of the Syrian government and prevent the takeover and the dismantling of the Syrian state, which, as we can imagine, would have led to a situation akin to what we've seen in Iraq, unfortunately, the last 20 years, which is basically endemic sectarian warfare and a lot of unstable governments, constant U.S. military presence, with unfortunately Iraqi parliament decisions being ignored in as far as getting the U.S. out. So I guess I will leave it at this point now, since we will discuss in the coming sessions, each country one after the other. But the situation is now turning drastically. The momentum of global affair is seeing China assuming a more and more active role. And as the proverbial saying has it, peace is breaking out everywhere. And plans that were being hatched to, for instance, pit the the Sunni world, embodied by Saudi Arabia, against Iran, failed miserably. And the Chinese were able to get the two sides to agree to reopen diplomatic relations. We are already seeing the direct aftershock, and it is an aftershock because to me it is nothing less than a seismic event, this reconciliation within the world of Islam, which was artificially maintained for decades, let's say it, through what they call the fitna. And now we're seeing already, the byproduct of this new paradigm, with the Yemen negotiating process picking up pace. Exchange of prisoners are scheduled to take place after the end of Ramadan, and we can expect more development in trying to bring the Middle East, the long-deserved stability and peace that it finally deserves. Thank you very much.